Now, we're in the midst of examining what the Old Testament has to say on the subject of homosexual conduct. And the foundational text, as I've tried to emphasize, is the creation of man and woman in Genesis chapter 2, which, as acknowledged by Jesus in Matthew chapter 19, establishes that marriage and the sexual intimacy that are part of marriage are intended by God to be between the two sexes He created in the beginning. Male and female are sexual complements to each other. The woman having been created out of the man, and only they are to join back together in the sexual union of marriage. So that is the foundational text. And we saw in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 5, it confirms the importance in God's sight and the fundamental nature of this sexual distinction. And then we looked at the explicit condemnation of homosexual conduct in Leviticus 18:22 and Leviticus chapter 20, verse 13. And I spent a fair amount of time examining the various arguments that homosexual advocates make in trying to get around this explicit condemnation in those Leviticus texts. And I explained to you why those arguments are invalid. They're bogus, but they confuse people who haven't thought about these things. So that's where we are now. At the end of the class, last class, I mentioned the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, and I'll repeat that reminder of the story, and then after that, then we'll pick up and go on. Now, we see in the latter part of Genesis chapter 18 that God had determined to destroy the sinful cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Those cities were paragons of wickedness. Paragons of wickedness. The Lord says in Genesis 18:20 that the outcry against the cities is great, and their sin is very grave. As two angels in the form of men. So these angels in the form of men, as they're heading to Sodom, God agrees in response to Abraham's plea not to destroy the city if only 10 righteous people can be found in the whole place. So that's an indication of how bad the city was. In Genesis 19, the two angels, they arrive in Sodom in the evening, and Lot takes them into his home, and all the men of the city, young men, old men, they surround Lot's house, and they demand that these visiting men be brought out so they can have sex with them. And Lot begs this mob not to act so wickedly. And he even offers his 2 virgin daughters to dissuade them from raping these men who, unbeknownst to everybody in Sodom, are angels. But he offers his virgin daughters to persuade them, to dissuade them from raping these men. And the angels, you remember, pull Lot back into the house. They blind the mob. And the next day, Sodom, Gomorrah, and the cities of the plain were destroyed. Now, the question, as I said last week, the question for our purpose in this narrative, in this story, is whether the homosexual aspect of the intended rape, whether that's presented by the inspired writer as a compounding offense. See, whether it's presented as something in addition to the rape and the violation of hospitality that shows the men of Sodom to be particularly heinous. Is it a compounding thing that the writer intends for the reader to hear and go, oh, they're even doing that? Or is it merely incidental to the story? You see, is it something that was not seen as part of the overall wickedness of the people that justified their destruction by God? That's the question for our purposes. Is it an aggravating, compounding offense, the purpose of which is to show just how wicked the people are? Or is it just an incidental fact that isn't to be considered in the idea of the overall wickedness of the people? In other words, is the story like hearing about someone who raped his own mother? Where in that case you would realize that the incest is an aggravating circumstance. You would say, of course rape is horrible. But this guy compounded that by raping his own mother. Is it supposed to be viewed like that? Or is it supposed to be viewed as a rape with no aggravating elements? You see, that's the question to get at. And what is God's view of homosexual conduct? Now, before answering that, I should note the claim of a few people who claim that, look, the demand of the mob of the men of Sodom to know the visitors. When they gather, then they say, bring them so we may know them. Some people say, well, look, that didn't have anything to do with sex at all. It was just a request to get acquainted with the people. Now, people actually say that. Okay, well, that is, of course, silly. To know oftentimes serves as a euphemism for sexual intercourse. And the immediate context here makes that meaning absolutely clear. I mean, in 19:8, Genesis 19:8, Lot says his two daughters had not known a man. Well, certainly he doesn't mean they weren't acquainted with any man. He means they hadn't had sexual relations. They were virgins. That's what he meant. And a desire to get acquainted would not qualify as acting wickedly, which is how Lot describes the conduct in Genesis 19:7. And a request to get acquainted, that wouldn't prompt Lot to offer his virgin daughters to them. Hi, we'd like to meet these people. Well, here are my virgin daughters. Okay, it's just silly. But I point that out to you because you may run across that, and it just shows the extent to which some people will go to try to dodge what God is saying. Instead of sitting at the feet and listening to what God has to say and wanting to know what does God, they come with an agenda and are trying to crowbar the Bible into what they want it to mean. And as I've said, that's no way to treat the Bible. You and I sit under the Word of God, listening to God and doing the best we can to hear what is God saying. Now, we can know that the homosexual aspect of the intended rape there in Sodom, we can know that it was expected to be understood as a compounding, aggravating offense from several lines of evidence, the first of which is the heterosexual prerequisite for sexual intercourse that is expressed in the creation text, and the prohibition of homosexual conduct that's expressed in Leviticus in the text that we've already looked at. They establish that how God views homosexual conduct, and that he views it as a serious offense against his created order. Okay, so there's no reason to think that Moses intends that element to be overlooked in the Sodom story. We have Genesis, we have Leviticus, part of the corpus of the law, the first 5 books. And we see clearly in there how God sees this. And so when that's reported in the Sodom account, why would anybody think you were supposed to ignore that element? You see, unless there's some indication, by the way, ignore this or this is different. So that's the first reason you see it. And second, according to Ezekiel, let's see if the clicker works today. You ready? Hold your breath. We're good. All right. Ezekiel 16, 49 to 50 says here that Sodom did not take hold of the hand of the poor and needy, that they neglected the poor and needy, which is serious. This is sinful. And they grew haughty and committed an abomination, to'avah, before me, and I removed them when I saw it. Now, there are those that say, listen, you see that the offense of Sodom, it really had nothing to do with sexual matters, nothing to do with homosexual conduct at all. The offense really was, you see here, that they simply neglected the poor and the needy. And that is what it was, you see, that's how they grew haughty. It was through their neglect of the poor and needy, and that was the abomination that they did. It was simply their neglect of the poor and needy. That's one of the things that they say. But you see here that Ezekiel, he sits here, he says, and they grew haughty and committed an abomination. And we can see in the next text I'll put up in Ezekiel 18 that Ezekiel views committing an abomination as a distinct offense from their neglecting the poor and needy. You see in 18:10 to 13, it says if he fathers a son who's violent, a shedder of blood, who does any of these things, though he himself did none of these things, who even eats upon the mountains, defiles his neighbor's wife, oppresses the poor and needy, commits robbery, does not restore the pledge, lift up his eyes to the idols, commits abomination. So you see here in this situation, just 2 chapters later, you see that Ezekiel distinguishes between neglecting the poor and needy and committing an abomination. So back in the Ezekiel text 16:49-50, where he says, they did not take hold of the hand of the poor and needy, and they grew haughty, and committed an abomination, he's referring to distinctive offenses. Well, what would the distinctive offense be of committing an abomination? Well, we have a good idea. In Sodom, males were seeking to have sex with males, and in Leviticus chapter 20, verse 13, that offense is specifically labeled what? An abomination. Okay, so it makes sense that this is how Ezekiel is understanding what's going on. Robert Gagnon says, Ezekiel in 1650 was apparently interpreting the Sodom episode through the lens of the absolute prohibition of man-male intercourse in Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13, indicating that he understood the same-sex dimension of the rape to be a compounding offense. Okay, so that's the question we're looking at. When the Sodom story, how are we to understand the homosexual aspect of the intended rape? Is it an aggravating circumstance? Is it part of the wickedness? And the answer is yes. We see that from what God says in the Old Testament about homosexual relations. We see it here in Ezekiel. And then third, in Jude verse 7, Jude verse 7 says that God judged Sodom and Gomorrah because they indulged in sexual immorality and went after different flesh. Okay, so he's specifying here. They indulged in sexual immorality and went after different flesh. So sexual immorality certainly was part of their guilt. So the idea that it was simply their neglect in the poor and needy is ruled out. Certainly sexual element was there. But what is this thing? They indulged in sexual immorality and went after different flesh. Well, the claim that some make here in Jude 7 is, well, what was sexually immoral about what they were doing? It wasn't their attempt to have sex with the visitor. Well, it was their attempt to have sex with the visitor, but what was sexually immoral about that is not that the visitors were males. So we had males trying to have sex with males. It was that they were angels. So that's what it was. So they went after different flesh, meaning they went after angels. But the problem with that is that in Genesis 19, nobody in Sodom knows that they're angels. You see, nobody in Sodom knows that these people, that the men are angels, that they just simply appear as men. The angels appeared simply as men. And it was the desire to have sex with them as men that constituted this immorality of which Jude speaks in verse 7. Indeed, flesh, it's not a natural word to apply to angels. You see, that wouldn't be a natural word that you would apply to angels. Different flesh more likely refers to that flesh which is unnatural for a male to pursue the flesh of other men. And in fact, that is the view of most commentators. It is not some, niche of some fundamentalist, small-minded, homophobic, hateful group of people. That is the view of most commentators, is that is how one is to understand other flesh. They went after other flesh. For example, Peter Davids, and a very well-known New Testament scholar, David says in his commentary, in that none of the other Jewish references to the sin of Sodom, and there are many, and I'll talk about them in a bit, none of the other Jewish references to the sin of Sodom is at all concerned that the strangers involved were angels. It's more likely that Jude, too, is thinking of homosexual activity as the different type of flesh. Different, not from themselves, not the difference between human and angel, but from the women they were supposed to desire. This would be in line with the general Jewish rejection of homosexual relations. So on the Sodom story we're looking at, the question is the fact that it's male on male, is the homosexual aspect to be seen as an aggravating or compounding circumstance? That seems to be how Jude sees it. Douglas Moo, another well-known, internationally known New Testament scholar, he says, probably then, the usual interpretation is correct, Jude associates God's judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah with the homosexual practices of its inhabitants. Thomas Schreiner, who's another New Testament scholar, says in his commentary on Jude, he says, it would be strange to designate a desire for angels as a desire for other flesh, sarkos heteros. The term more naturally refers to a desire for those of the same sex. They desired flesh other than that of women. For various reasons, some are attempting today to question the view that homosexuality receives an unqualified negative verdict in the Scriptures. Such attempts have been singularly unsuccessful. The biblical writers in the Jewish tradition unanimously condemned homosexuality as evil. Now, so you look at this and you say, okay, well, is it a compounding offense? You say, well, yes, we have in the Old Testament, we have this view of God quite clear, so why would you think it wasn't a compounding offense? We have the text in Ezekiel that makes it clear. We have Jude 7 that points out that it's a compounding offense. But even if one understands in the Jude 7 text the different flesh, the argument I say, look, no. Indulged in sexual immorality and went after other flesh, different flesh. That means that the problem was that they were going after angels. You say, well, no, that doesn't make as much sense as what I've just presented. But even if other flesh referred to angels, even if that were right, that would not change the fact, that would not support the homosexual view, in that wouldn't mean that the immorality he's speaking of was in their going after angels. Let me read to you what Gagnon says. He says, a paratactic construction, don't worry about that, in Greek, can just as easily make the first clause subordinate. In this case, by or in the course of committing sexual immorality, they went after other flesh. In other words, in the process of attempting the sexually immoral act of having intercourse with other men, the men of Sodom got more than they bargained for, committing an offense unknowingly against angels. And here I've tried to give you how that would look out understood paratactically. It would be likewise Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, which in similar manner to these indulged in sexual immorality by going after men, and thereby, in the course of indulging in that sexual immorality of going after men, went after, unbeknownst to them, different flesh, angels, as set forth as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. So even if you bought that argument that, look, no, other flesh refers to angels, it doesn't rescue their position. Okay? So here we have Jude 7. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 6 likewise speaks of God's incineration of Sodom and Gomorrah. Verse 7 says Lot was distressed. 2 Peter 2:7, he says, Lot was distressed by the conduct of the lawless in their licentiousness. In their licentiousness. So the destruction is associated with the people's licentiousness, and the word licentiousness refers generally to a lack of self-restraint that leads to conduct beyond all bounds, but it speaks especially of sexual excesses. It speaks particularly and especially of sexual excesses. So Peter interprets the Sodom story as involving sexual impropriety, contrary to the argument that it was simply the neglect of the poor. Okay, he interprets it as involving sexual immorality. Douglas Moo writes, he says, as Peter points out, Genesis 19 suggests that Lot did not participate in the rampant homosexuality that characterized the cities and was indeed distressed by it. So these are all reasons when I look at this text and somebody comes to me and says, oh, no, you're misreading this idea. The homosexual aspect of the intended rape at Sodom is simply incidental. It's not to be understood as an aggravating circumstance or a compounding offense to heighten the wickedness of the inhabitants there. It's not to be understood similarly to the case of somebody who rapes his own mother. No, it's just an incidental thing. I'm going through the reasons why I'm not convinced by that. Now, another reason is that ancient Jewish interpreters, they recognized Sodom's wickedness included the homosexual element of the men's intended action. So I'm not like the Lone Ranger here. I'm standing in a stream of interpretive history where all of these Jewish people understood this. So it's not bizarre, it's not quirky, it's not trying to foist something on the text. I'm standing in the stream of how people have read it forever. An example, Philo, first century Jew. Philo's a first century Jew. He writes in his work, Abraham, he says, the Sodomites threw off from their necks the law of nature and applied themselves to forbidden forms of intercourse. Not only in their mad lust for women did they violate the marriages of their neighbors, but also men mounted males without respect for the sex nature which the active partner shares with the passive. So this is how Philo, a first century Jew, understood this. The homosexual element of the Sodom story is noted in Josephus, who's another first century Jewish writer. Earlier Jewish texts, going back a century or more, speak condemningly of Sodom's fornication. You see that in Jubilees, you see that in the Testament of Benjamin, and these presumably include the homosexual element as part of the offense when they speak condemningly of Sodom's fornication. With all that we see about how God views homosexual conduct, so you see, how are the Jews viewing this? Well, they have understood that the homosexual aspect is something that is an aggravating circumstance there. And finally, on this point about whether Sodom, the homosexual aspect is an aggravating circumstance in Sodom, early Christian writers routinely emphasized the homosexual aspect of the Sodom story. David Wright, he died in 2008, but he was an internationally recognized expert on the thought of the early church. David Wright says, many fathers emphasize, he means early church people, the homosexual lust of the Sodomites. Now, why am I saying that? This is because we not only have the Jewish stream, we have the early Christian stream. How are they understanding this? I'm not the Johnny-come-lately. It's these people who within the last 60 years, after thousands of years, have said, we've seen something nobody else saw before. Okay? Now, if you got that kind of insight, you're going to have to argue that. You see? You don't just get to declare that. Because right away, you have to be suspicious. When you've got something novel, after thousands of years, you're going to have to make that case. Okay? And that better be a strong case. But anyway, Wright says, many fathers emphasize the homosexual lust of the Sodomites. He cites as examples Methodius, John Chrysostom, Macarius, Augustine, Gregory the Great. He says, some criticize other aspects of their depravity, but no patristic source excludes a homosexual interpretation of their conduct. So you have many specifying that, some talking about other things, and none excluding that. Now, you see a parallel. So this is the Sodom story, another aspect of the Old Testament's view of homosexual conduct. We see a parallel to that in the rape of the Levite's concubine in Judges chapter 19. Judges chapter 19, verses 22 to 25. You know the story. There's a Levite from Ephraim. He's returning to Ephraim from Bethlehem with his concubine. And they stopped in Gibeah, which is a territory in Benjamin. They stop in Gibeah, and they're finally taken in by an old man who was himself originally from Ephraim. And just as in Sodom, what happens? The men of the city, they come and they demand that the old man bring out the male visitor so that they can have sex with him. Now you see what this is paralleling. Here we had Sodom. Now this is taking place within Israel. No angels, by the way. This is taking place within Israel. And the old man urges them not to act wickedly and not to do this disgraceful thing. And the old man offered his virgin daughter and the concubine. You see, rather than have them do this shameful thing to this Levite man, he offers his virgin daughter and the concubine, but the men were unwilling. And then you remember the Levite shoves his concubine out the door. He throws her out the door, and she was raped and murdered, and this became a national outrage, which triggered a civil war in which the tribe of Benjamin ultimately was defeated. And so here we have this situation. Now, given the condemnation of homosexual conduct that God makes clear in the creation text, in Deuteronomy, in Leviticus, in Sodom, given that condemnation, one cannot reasonably claim that the homosexual aspect of this episode didn't add to the dimension of horror that was felt by the old man and the Levite and the author of the book of Judges. Here's what Gagnon says: repugnance for male penetration of males must have been a significant factor in twice designating the demand for intercourse with the Levite as a disgraceful thing, much greater than that involving intercourse with the old man's daughter and the Levite's concubine. Is that bad? Wrong? Sure it is. But part of the idea is to show it's that crazy. It's that wicked. You see, it's gone to that level. And so that's part of what's going on in the narrative, in the story, and that's important to recognize. And anybody who tries to drain that out is just misreading the Bible, is misunderstanding that. Another tidbit, really, in the Old Testament's view of homosexual conduct deals with cult prostitution in Israel. Now, the worship of false gods by the Canaanites and the nations that surrounded ancient Israel, sometimes that worship of those false gods included prostitution. Devotees of the deity, both men and women, would offer themselves sexually to male worshipers as a way for them to connect with the gods so as to induce the gods' blessing. So you had these devotees of this pagan god, male and female, who would offer themselves to these male worshipers as a way for those worshipers to connect with God, and the idea that this would induce the God's blessing. And these people are commonly called temple or cult prostitutes. Now, Deuteronomy 23, 17 and 18, in this text, Moses issues a warning to the Israelites about cult prostitution as they're about to enter the promised land. So he's warning them about this. And he says, none of the daughters of Israel shall be a cult prostitute, nor shall any of the sons of Israel be a cult prostitute. You shall not bring the hire of a harlot or the wages of a dog into the house of the Lord your God for any votive offering, for both of these are an abomination to the Lord your God. You see, there's no doubt that cult prostitution was offensive to God for a number of reasons. Okay, there's no doubt about that. But notice that the male prostitute is given the label dog in verse 18. The male prostitute gets that. It's obvious from the parallel, right? Daughters, cult prostitute; son, cult prostitute; hire of a harlot; wages of a dog. I mean, it's referring to the male cult prostitute is obvious from the parallel. And in fact, a number of translations, like the New Revised Standard, the New English Translation, the Christian Standard Bible, the New International Version, they in fact make it clearer by simply translating dog there, male prostitute. So they go ahead and just specify it. But what it says is dog. And dog, it refers to a male prostitute. And dog was a pervasive slam in the ancient world. It was a pervasive slam in the ancient world. And the fact that epithet is applied to male prostitutes is in keeping with God's consistent and strongly negative view of homosexual conduct throughout the Bible. Why do you think they're referred to that way? God's being mean. No, God is expressing his revulsion at it. That's why. That's not new, is it? What does he say in Leviticus? So that's just a little tidbit that's easy to miss, that is consistent with God's view there. Now, before examining, I've been looking at what the Old Testament has to say. I'm going to go on and to look at what the New Testament has to say. People are wondering, how can you take this many weeks? Well, there's a lot of stuff to talk about. And there are a lot of arguments to try to address. But I'm going to move on to the New Testament. Before I do that, it's helpful to see how homosexual conduct was viewed in first century Judaism. I mean, that's relevant, right? I mean, since Jesus, the apostles, all the writers of the New Testament except Luke, since they're Jews, we can assume, unless there's some indication to the contrary, that they shared the Jewish view of things. Right? I mean, they're first century Jews. They're the ones writing. So this is important to understand. Being aware of this religious and cultural context, see, that will help us to interpret the New Testament correctly. So before going and examining the text of the New Testament, I want to look at first century Judaism's view of homosexual conduct. This also will tell us, are we on the right track? Have I imposed on these texts some kind of eccentric and odd interpretation that those in the first century didn't share? Well, if you did, then you got to go back and rethink. And maybe you still have insight, and maybe they were wrong. That happens sometimes. But it's important to look. Now, extra-biblical, outside the Bible, extra-biblical Jewish writings before, during, and after the first century are unanimous in their rejection of homosexual conduct, which comes as no surprise. At least I hope it doesn't come as a surprise, given the condemnation of that conduct in the Old Testament as I've tried to explain it. I would have been shocked, given this evidence, if somebody came and said, by the way, this is okay. Well, they don't. They unanimously see the text the way I've laid them out for you. That in fact, it is condemned. In the following writings that range from 200 BC to AD 200. Okay, that's the 400-year window. In that window, in these writings that range from there, homosexual conduct is condemned. The letter of Aristeas, Sibylline Oracles 3, the sentences of Pseudo-Facilides, the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, Sibylline Oracles 5, Mishnah Sanhedrin 7:4, 3 writings of Philo, 2 writings of Josephus, and depending on how it's dated, 2nd Enoch. Now let me give you just an example of a taste of some of these. The letter of Aristeas, a Jewish writing that is commonly understood to be dated between 130 BC and 70 BC, though some would put it earlier than that. Here's what we find in the letter of Aristeas. We have been distinctly separated, we being Jews. We've been distinctly separated from the rest of mankind. For most other men defile themselves by promiscuous intercourse, thereby working great iniquity. And whole countries and cities pride themselves upon such vices. This is us. Right? Yeah, no, this is us. We take great pride in our sexual liberty and we think it's cool. And we think anybody that thinks otherwise, there's something wrong with them. You see, we take great pride in this. And it's just rebellion. He says, for they not only have intercourse with men, right? I mean, clearly wrong. They not only do that, but they defile their own mothers and even their daughters. But we've been kept separate from such sins. So far, we are dodging the latter two, but this is coming. Yeah, I'm telling you. I pay attention to this kind of stuff. And this stuff about a guy in New York who was sleeping with his daughter, all of that. Oh, no, there shouldn't be any problem with that. Some stuff going on with animals over in Europe. This ought to be okay. And I remember years ago telling people where this was headed. That's crazy. You're a paranoiac. I said, yeah, maybe. But I think I can see. I see how the wind's blowing. And so anyway, but that's not my point here. I just want you to see here in the letter of Aristeas the viewpoint that is shared there about homosexual conduct. And then in the sentences of Pseudo-Facilides, which is typically dated 50 BC to AD 100, so a wider window, 50 BC to AD 100, it says, do not transgress with unlawful sex the limits set by nature. For even animals are not pleased by intercourse of male with male, and let women not imitate the sexual role of men. Jewish writing? Where do they get such a crazy idea? Well, you know where they got it. They got it out of the Old Testament. Now, asking me, since he finds people at his work who say, well, no, they find these cases where there's homosexual conduct among certain animals. I said, well, in the first place, I'm not going this evolution thing because I'm talking about to the church of people who believe in the Bible and who believe that God is the creator. But if we're going to start setting our moral standards by what animals do, then we can start eating our kids. And we can do all kinds of things. Okay, so that's not terribly impressive to me. I got to tell you the story. It's a little bit off track, but I love it. Brother John wasn't a Christian then. This is years ago. He was a raving atheist, evolutionist. And he went to the Washington Zoo with our oldest brother, and he was just really excited. They were going to go see the gorilla. And he was so excited. His anticipation was he was going to see this very thoughtful gorilla sitting there, perhaps posed and pondering the universe and, just sitting there. So he's coming up to see this gorilla, and he's just looking at this gorilla. The gorilla proceeds to vomit and then eat it. And Bitsy, that's John, he turns to my brother and he goes, that's an animal. Indeed. So that was an epiphany for Brother John there. Okay, nothing extra for that. All right, Mishnah Sanhedrin 7:4. All right, this dates to around AD 200, but it reflects an earlier tradition. It says, these are the felons who are put to death by stoning. He who has sexual relations with his mother, with the wife of his father, with his daughter-in-law, with a male, with a cow or a beast, and the woman who brings an ox or beast on top of herself. Okay, so here I want you to see, in reading the Old Testament the way, how do first century Jews understand this? The complete and uniform rejection of homosexual conduct in ancient Judaism is beyond dispute. Okay, 5 minutes, let me try to prove that to you. Okay, here's what Gagnon says. I'm going to give you scholars. This is their world. This is what they play in. Here's Gagnon, who I told you, he did his doctorate on this topic. He's written 2 books on it, countless articles on it. He says, as we shall see, the evidence suggests that early Judaism was unanimous in its rejection of homosexual conduct. We are unaware of any dissenting voices. That was the first bell, right? Yes, okay, good. Jackie Naudet, this is an Old Testament scholar, writes in the New International Dictionary of Old Testament Theology and Exegesis, the uniform conviction of the Israelites was that coitus should be heterosexual as part of the order of creation. Craig Keener, a prolific, well-known Bible scholar. Ancient Judaism regarded homosexual activity and bestiality as subcategories of the larger issue of sexual immorality. Jewish people usually viewed homosexual behavior as a pervasively and uniquely Gentile sin. They thought, this is so crazy. This is the mark of Gentiles. And he says, they regarded homosexual behavior as meriting death or punishment by God in the afterlife. According to the Dictionary of Judaism in the biblical period, you probably didn't know such a thing existed, but it does. It says, the rabbis deemed the biblical prohibition against homosexuality to be one of the 7 Noahide commandments which apply to all nations of the earth. Further, like Romans, Paul's letter to the Romans, rabbinic law explicitly extends to women the biblical prohibition against homosexuality, forbidding sex between women under the general prohibition against following the abhorrent practices of the Canaanites. At the time, at least as far as Jews were concerned, the rabbis apparently saw homosexuality and lesbianism as almost unthinkable and only infrequently referred to such practices. The Old Testament scholar Michael Brown, he declares, in first century Jewish culture, Homosexual practice was explicitly prohibited and forbidden. In fact, ancient Jewish texts from the last centuries BC and the first centuries have some very negative things to say about homosexual practice and not one single positive thing to say. Several pages later, he says, as I stated above, every single reference to homosexual practice in ancient Jewish world is 100% negative, sometimes in the strongest terms, and there is not a single positive reference to be found. Now that's something. If you've played in the theology world for a long time, to have such uniformity on something means you're standing in a very strong stream in terms of interpretation. James Dunn, internationally known Bible scholar, I won't bore you with all that he's written, but just very well-known fellow. He says, but Jewish reaction to homosexuality as a perversion, a pagan abomination, is consistent throughout the Old Testament, with the sin of Sodom often recalled as a terrible warning. In the period of early Judaism, abhorrence of homosexuality is not just part of the reaction against Greek mores, since we find it also in those most influenced by Greek thought. Note also the sustained polemic against sexual promiscuity and homosexuality in the testament of the 12 patriarchs, particularly the testament of Levi, testament of Naphtali, Sibylline oracles. See further Strack and Billerbeck, which is a resource on Jewish interaction or reflection on things. Well, not on homo, but just Jewish reaction of how it ties in. All right. In other words, antipathy to homosexuality remains a consistent and distinctive feature of Jewish understanding of what man's createdness involves and requires. David Wright, who's that expert in the history or in thought of the early church, David Wright says homosexuality was largely unknown in Judaism, but Christianity inherited unqualified condemnations of male homosexual practice in Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13. The import of these verses cannot be limited to behavior associated with pagan cults. That's one of the arguments that people try to make that I talked to you about. Any more than the prohibition of child sacrifice in 1821 or bestiality in 2015. Post-biblical Judaism stressed the homosexual element in the Sodomites' attempted rape, of Lot's male guest, and Hellenistic Jewish writers denounced homosexuality as frequently as any sin. Yes, I heard that bell. But what I'm doing now, we're going to look at the New Testament data. But I've tried to explain to you how the Old Testament views homosexual conduct. Before we look at the New Testament, I'm now letting you see what is the environment, the Jewish environment, and what is the Jewish thought world about homosexual conduct in the first century. And that will help us as we look at some of these things and look at some of these arguments. Well, Jesus didn't say anything about that. That's not right, in fact. But had he not, what is one to assume from that? Is one to assume that he's jettisoned all Jewish theology? Or would one take that he didn't say anything because he was down with that? You see? That'd be the question. Anyway, that's why I'm telling you this. I want you to see how I'm doing it. Then after this, we'll go on. I have just a little bit more to say here. Then we'll go on and look at the New Testament text, and then we'll be finished. Okay? Thanks for coming.